The fluorescent lights in Sage Grove Center hummed with a frequency designed to agitate. Dr. Ellen Vogelbaum's successor, a man named Cardosa, had specified this years ago in a memo about behavioral compliance. The test subjects heard it constantly. Most staff had learned to tune it out. Monica Reyes had not. She stood in the observation booth, overlooking Lab 7 clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield, and counted the seconds between each pulse of that mechanical whine. 12 seconds. Always 12. The rhythm had become her anchor during the V-null trials, something predictable in a facility where predictability was a lie they sold to shareholders. Below, behind reinforced glass that could theoretically withstand a direct hit from a soup running at terminal velocity, Subject 17 lay strapped to a surgical table. The restraints were rated for Class A superhuman strength. They had never failed. Vaught's legal team made sure everyone knew that fact by heart. Monica had seen 3 subjects die during V-null trials. One had simply stopped breathing. Another had torn himself apart from the inside blood vessels, rupturing in sequence like a string of fireworks. The third had screamed for 6 hours before his vocal cords shredded. They had all signed waivers. Vaught's legal team made sure everyone knew that fact, too. "Vitals are stable," said Chen, the senior technician, his voice flat with the exhaustion of a man who had stopped sleeping well months ago. "Heart rate 62, blood pressure 120/80, brain activity nominal." Nominal. Monica hated that word. It reduced human suffering to a checkbox. Cardoza entered the booth without knocking. He never knocked. His suit was immaculate charcoal gray, with a Vought International pin on the lapel polished until it caught the light. He smelled like expensive cologne and boardroom ambition. "Status," he said. "V-null compound introduced at 0400, Monica replied, glancing at her notes, even though she had memorized every detail. Subject metabolized the initial dose without rejection. Neural activity spiked at 0417, then stabilized. No visible mutation, no loss of consciousness. "That's different," Cardoza said. "Different, not good, not hopeful. Different." In Sage Grove, different meant profitable or dead, and they would not know which until the quarterly reports came in. Cardoza stepped closer to the glass. Below, Subject 17 opened his eyes. The change was immediate and absolute. One moment the man had been slack-jawed and drugged pupils dilated from the sedatives they had pumped into him to keep him manageable during the injection. The next moment, he was awake. Not groggy, not confused. Awake. He turned his head with the deliberate precision of someone taking inventory. His gaze swept across the lab, tracking every camera, every vent, every exit. When his eyes found the observation booth, Monica felt her breath catch. She had seen soups before. Homelander had visited Sage Grove once 3 years ago for a photo op that never made it to press. She remembered his smile, bright and practiced, and the cold calculation behind it. She remembered feeling like prey. This was different. Subject 17 did not look at her with hunger or malice. He looked at her the way a chess player looks at a board, assessing, categorizing, already 3 moves ahead. "Chen," Cardoza said quietly, "run a cognitive baseline. I want to know if we've got another lamplighter situation." Lamplighter had been a telepath. Minor league barely strong enough to pull thoughts from someone standing 3 feet away, but strong enough to cause problems. Vought had buried him in paperwork and NDAs until he stopped existing in any meaningful sense. Chen's fingers moved across the console. Monitors flickered. Below, Subject 17 closed his eyes again. "Baseline running," Chen said. Estimated time 4 minutes. Cardoza leaned back against the console, arms crossed. 4 minutes. You know what we could sell in 4 minutes, Ray, as a treatment for PTSD? A combat enhancer for JSOC. A goddamn miracle. He paused. Or a lawsuit that costs us everything. Monica said nothing. She had learned that silence was the only safe response to Cardoza's rhetorical questions. The minutes stretched. The fluorescent lights hummed. Subject 17 remained still, eyes closed, breathing steady. The monitors showed nothing unusual. Heart rate stable. Brain activity nominal. Everything was fine. And then the guard by the airlock door blinked, frowned, and turned his rifle toward his partner. Chen, Monica said. Chen was staring at his monitor. I'm seeing anomalous readings. Neural field extending past the subject's cranial boundary. It's not possible. The sensors must be... The guard fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space of the lab, a sharp crack that turned Monica's legs to water. The round punched through his partner's shoulder, spinning the man around in a spray of red mist. He hit the floor hard. The shooter stared at his own hands, rifle shaking. What the fuck? He whispered. What the fuck? I didn't... The second guard, bleeding, scrambled for the emergency lockdown panel. His hand slapped the button. Klaxon shrieked. Red warning lights strobed across the lab. Blast doors began to descend with the mechanical certainty of a guillotine. Cardoza grabbed the intercom. Abort override authorization, Cardoza 77 Omega, open the goddamn doors! The blast doors stopped, reversed, rose 3 feet, and then slammed shut. Cardoza stared. Chen swore in Mandarin, a rapid-fire string of words Monica did not understand, but recognized as panic. Below in the lab, the wounded guard had made it to the airlock. He was pounding on the door, shouting something lost beneath the klaxons. The other guard had dropped his rifle and was backing away from Subject 17, hands raised. I didn't mean to, he kept saying. I didn't fucking mean to. Subject 17 sat up. The restraints had not been released. Vaught's legal team would later confirm this in a report that took 6 weeks to compile and 3 months to bury. The restraints, rated for Class A superhuman strength designed to hold someone who could bench press a truck, simply parted. Leather tore, steel buckles bent. Subject 17 stood, and the pieces of his former confinement fell away like shed skin. He was not a large man. 5'10", maybe 170, soaking wet. The kind of build you would pass on the street without a second glance. But when he moved, there was a fluidity to it that made Monica think of predators. Not the showy, preening dominance of someone like Homelander. Something older. Patient. He walked to the guard who had fired the shot. The man was weeping now, snot and tears running down his face, words tumbling out in a desperate stream. I didn't mean it. I swear to Christ I didn't mean it. Something made me. I don't know what happened. Please. Subject 17 placed a hand on the man's shoulder. The guard stopped talking. His eyes went wide, pupils contracting to pinpoints. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his knees buckled, and he sat down hard on the floor, staring at nothing. Chen, Cardoza said, voice tight. Gas the lab, now. Chen hesitated. Monica saw the math running behind his eyes. Gas meant the wounded guard died too. Gas meant admitting they had lost control. Gas meant Cardoza would throw him under the bus if this went illegal. Now, God damn it. Chen slammed his palm on the emergency release. Vents in the ceiling hissed. White vapor poured into the lab, thick and fast. The wounded guard stopped pounding on the door. He slumped against the frame, then slid down, eyes rolling back. Subject 17 looked up at the vents. He did not run, did not panic. He simply stood in the center of the room and waited as the gas swirled around him. 30 seconds. That was the manufacturer's guarantee. 30 seconds to incapacitate any soupy short of Homelander himself. Monica counted them off one by one, waiting for Subject 17 to drop. He did not drop. He tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he looked directly at the observation booth, directly at Cardoza, and he smiled. It was not a cruel smile, not triumphant. It was the smile of someone who had just understood the rules of a game and found them amusing. The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, bathing the lab in red. Subject 17 was gone. The airlock doors stood open. The guard who had fired the shot sat on the floor, rocking back and forth. The wounded guard was not breathing. Monica heard Cardoza breathing beside her, rapid and shallow. She heard Chen muttering something that might have been a prayer. She heard the klaxons winding down into silence, and she heard footsteps in the hallway beyond the observation booth. Slow, measured, coming closer. Cardoza backed toward the door, fumbling for his phone. Security. Security to Observation 7. We have a code. The door opened. Subject 17 stood in the doorway, backlit by the red emergency lights. The gas had not touched him. Not a scratch, not a bruise. His hospital gown hung loose on his frame, and his feet were bare. He should have looked vulnerable. He did not. I need to understand something, he said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. There was no accent Monica could place, no regional markers. It was the voice of someone who had learned English, but had never lived anywhere long enough to pick up its quirks. Cardoza held up his phone like a talisman. Stay back. I'm calling. You're calling no one, Subject 17 said. He did not raise his voice, did not move from the doorway. But Cardoza's hand stopped phone halfway to his ear. Monica watched her boss's face go slack, watched his eyes lose focus, watched him lower the phone slowly, mechanically, and set it on the console. Chen bolted. He made it 2 steps before he stopped, turned, and walked calmly back to his station. He sat down. His hands moved across the keyboard, typing commands Monica could not see from her angle. You inject people with poison, Subject 17 said. You strap them down and hurt them until they become weapons or corpses. You do this in a place designed to look like medicine. He stepped into the booth. I need to understand. Is this a war or is it business? Cardoza opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Both, he managed. Subject 17 nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. Then you've already lost. He turned and walked out of the booth, leaving the door open behind him. Monica heard his footsteps receding down the hallway, heard the emergency doors opening for him, one after another, without resistance. She looked at Cardoza. Her boss stood frozen, staring at the space where Subject 17 had been. Sir, she said. Cardoza did not respond. Chen was still typing, fingers moving in a rhythm that had nothing to do with thought. Monica leaned over to see the screen. He was deleting files, lab records, test results, everything related to V-Null. She grabbed his shoulder. Chen, stop. He stopped. His hands fell to his sides. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were empty. He's in my head, Chen whispered. I can feel him. He's in my fucking head. Monica let go, stepped back. The fluorescent lights hummed their 12-second rhythm. Below in the lab, the guard who had fired the shot was still rocking, still muttering to himself. She looked at the monitors. The sensors were offline. The cameras were offline. Everything that could have recorded what just happened was dark. Vaught's legal team would ask her what she saw. They would ask her to sign things. They would ask her to forget. But Monica knew she would not forget the way Subject 17 had smiled. She would not forget the sound of his footsteps walking away. And she would not forget the question he had asked, the question that had no good answer. Is this a war? Or is it business? Both Cardosa had said. Monica had a feeling they were about to find out just how bad an answer that was. The call reached Homelander at 6:47 a.m., interrupting his morning routine of mirror affirmations and strategic Instagram planning. Ashley Barrett's voice crackled through his phone with the particular strain of someone who knew they were about to ruin his day. We have a situation at Sage Grove. Homelander set down his protein shake. Through his penthouse window, New York stretched out below him, small and manageable. Defined situation. A test subject, V-null trial. He's loose. So gas him, shoot him, I don't care. Homelander returned to his reflection, checking the angle of his cape. The fabric needed to fall just right for the GMA interview this afternoon. Why are you bothering me with this? There was a pause. Ashley was choosing her words carefully, which meant the situation was worse than she wanted to admit. The gas didn't work. Security fired on him. He walked out through 3 locked blast doors. Cardosa is not responding to communication. Homelander's smile remained fixed, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Not responding. The last message from the facility was 14 minutes ago. A doctor named Reyes. She said, and I'm quoting here, he asked if this was war or business. Then the line went dead. Homelander crushed the protein shake container. Liquid splattered across his glove. He stared at it for a moment, then wiped it off with slow, deliberate movements. I'll handle it. The press? We'll never hear about this, Homelander said. His voice dropped to the register he used when Ashley needed reminding of how things worked. Because I'm going to fly there, deal with this failed experiment, and be back in time for hair and makeup. Understand? Yes, of course. Thank you. Homelander ended the call and threw the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, expensive components scattering across imported marble. He had 17 identical phones. Vought replaced them monthly, along with the mirrors he broke and the furniture he damaged during his episodes. Episodes. That's what Ashley called them in the reports she thought he didn't read. He walked to the window and launched himself into the morning sky. The flight to Pennsylvania took 11 minutes. Homelander spent them running scenarios. A soup who could resist gas meant either enhanced metabolism or some kind of selective permeability. Not unheard of. The lamplighter knockoff they'd shelved last year had something similar. This would be the same. Walk in established dominance, maybe snap the subject's neck if he got mouthy. Clean, simple. Back in time for the interview. Sage Grove came into view, a sprawling complex disguised as a psychiatric facility. The parking lot was full of cars that would never leave, owned by test subjects who had signed their lives away for a chance at powers. Homelander had read the waivers once. The legal department had refined cruelty into an art form. He descended toward the main building boots, touching concrete with barely a sound. The entrance doors were open. No guards. No staff running to greet him with the usual nervous smiles and rehearsed praise. Homelander's jaw tightened. The lobby was empty. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white. A reception desk sat unmanned, computer monitors still glowing. Coffee in a Vought-branded mug was still steaming. "Hello," Homelander called out. His voice echoed. Nothing. He moved deeper into the facility, passing through corridors he'd walked during that photo op 3 years ago. Back then, the halls had been full of white coats and clipboards, everyone eager to show America's greatest hero their important work. Now there was only silence and the mechanical breathing of ventilation systems. Homelander's hearing was good enough to detect a heartbeat from 3 floors away. He stopped and listened. 37 heartbeats. Most were in the western wing, clustered together, hiding. Several more were scattered throughout the building, isolated and unmoving, dead or unconscious. And one directly ahead was steady and slow, calm. Homelander followed it. The trail led to Lab 7. The door was open. Inside, a man sat in a chair that had been dragged to the center of the room. He wore a hospital gown and nothing else. His feet were bare. His hair was dark, shoulder-length, unkempt. When he looked up at Homelander, his eyes were dark and still. "You're the one they sent," the man said. Not a question, an observation. Homelander stepped into the lab cape, settling behind him with practiced elegance. "I'm the one who's going to put you back in your cage." "No," the man said. "You're the product they designed to make people forget they're in cages." Homelander's smile sharpened. He'd heard speeches like this before. Every powered psychopath thought they were a philosopher. "Cute. Did you rehearse that? Or does being a failed science experiment come with pretentious dialogue?" The man stood. The movement was economical, no wasted motion. "I'm trying to understand your world. So far, everyone I've spoken to has been afraid. You're not afraid. Why the fuck would I be afraid of you?" "You shouldn't be," the man said. "Fear would mean you understand the situation." Homelander's eyes began to glow red. "Last chance. Get on your knees, hands behind your head, or I put you through that wall." The man tilted his head, studying Homelander with the detached interest of a researcher examining a specimen. "You wear a costume designed for cameras. You speak in sound bites. Everything about you is built for consumption." He paused. "Who are you when no one's watching?" The heat vision lanced out twin beams of superheated energy that could cut through steel. Homelander aimed for center mass, not to kill, but to hurt. To teach this subject, the lesson every soup learned eventually, Homelander was the top of the food chain. The beam struck something 6 inches from the man's chest and dispersed energy, scattering across an invisible surface like water hitting glass. The lab filled with red light and the smell of ozone. The man did not move, did not flinch. Homelander cut the beams and stared. The man remained standing, unmarked. Around him, the air seemed to shimmer, a distortion that Homelander's vision couldn't quite focus on. It looked like a rib cage made of fractured light there and not there, breaking the laws of optics in a way that made Homelander's eyes hurt. "What the hell is that?" Homelander said. "Protection," the man said simply. "You're very powerful. But power without understanding is just noise." Homelander moved. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second, faster than human eyes could track, and drove his fist toward the man's face with enough force to crater concrete. His fist stopped. Not slowed, not deflected. Stopped as if he'd punched a wall. The impact sent a shock wave through the lab, shattering monitors and toppling equipment. But the man stood unmoved, that impossible barrier holding firm. Homelander pulled back and struck again. And again. Each impact was a thunderclap. Each one failed to land. "You're used to winning," the man said over the sound of Homelander's assault. "Everyone falls. Everyone breaks. Everyone learns to fear you." Homelander roared and grabbed for the man's throat. His fingers closed on the barrier, and for a moment he felt resistance. Real physical resistance. Then something shifted. The lab disappeared. Homelander stood in a television studio. Bright lights, cameras. An audience packed into tiered seating, their faces blurred, but their attention absolute. He was on a stage standing under a spotlight, and he could hear a director's voice cutting through speakers. From the top, Homelander. Big smile. Remember, you're America's son. Homelander spun. The lab was gone. The man was gone. This was a set, a Vought production set, the kind they used for his commercials and public appearances. He knew this place. He'd been here 100 times. But he hadn't walked into a set. He'd been in Lab 7. He'd been fighting. "What is this?" he said. The audience laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of people watching a clown, a performer, a trained animal doing tricks. Homelander looked down and saw himself wearing his costume cape and all, but it looked different. Cheaper. The seams were visible. The colors were too bright garish. "Cut," the director's voice said. "Homelander, you're missing your mark. We talked about this." "This isn't real," Homelander said. More laughter. A woman walked onto the stage. She wore a business suit and carried a clipboard. Her face was Ashley's face, but wrong, stretched, and exaggerated like a caricature. "Homelander, the audience is waiting. Just read the lines." "I don't have any fucking lines." "You've always had lines," Ashley said. "Every word you've ever said was written by someone else. Every move you've made was choreographed. You're a product, Homelander. Products don't improvise." The audience applauded. Homelander looked out at them and saw their faces resolving into clarity. Vought executives, marketing teams, the board members who discussed his quarterly performance like he was a stock portfolio. They were all smiling at him with the indulgent patience of adults watching a child's tantrum. "This is in my head," Homelander said. "You're in my fucking head." "Is he?" asked a voice behind him. Homelander turned. The man from the lab stood at the edge of the stage, still wearing his hospital gown, still barefoot. But now the studio lights cast him in shadow, made him difficult to look at directly. "Or are you just seeing what was always there?" the man said. The stage began to crack. Fissures spread across the floor through the walls, up into the lights. The audience kept applauding, mechanical and endless. Ashley kept smiling. The director kept calling for another take. "Stop it," Homelander said. His voice cracked. "Stop this right now." "I haven't done anything," the man said. "You built this prison yourself. I'm just showing you the bars." Homelander lunged at him. His hands passed through empty air. The stage shattered completely, and he was falling through darkness, and he could hear his own voice echoing back at him. From 1,000 commercials, 1,000 interviews, 1,000 carefully scripted moments. "We're here to help. America's greatest hero. You can count on me." The voices layered over each other until they became meaningless noise, and Homelander wanted to scream, but he couldn't find his real voice under all the borrowed words. Then he was back in Lab 7. He was on his knees. His cape was tangled around his legs. His breathing came in ragged gasps. The man stood 3 feet away, watching him with that same calm expression. Homelander looked at his hands. They were shaking. "You're the flagship," the man said. "The most profitable product in Vought's catalog, tested, marketed, sold to the world as salvation." He crouched down to eye level. "But you know the truth. You've always known. They made you in a laboratory. They raised you in a cell. They taught you to smile and wave and bleed for cameras." "Shut up," Homelander whispered. You're not a hero. You're not even a person. You're a brand. And brands don't have power. They have market share. Homelander's eyes glowed red again, but the heat vision didn't come. He couldn't focus, couldn't think past the echo of that studio audience laughing at him. The man stood and walked toward the door. They'll tell you this was a hallucination, a side effect of my abilities. They'll help you rationalize it. He paused in the doorway. But you'll remember. Every time you read a script, every time you hit your mark, you'll remember that someone saw through you. He left. Homelander stayed on his knees, staring at nothing, trying to remember how to be angry instead of afraid. He was still there 20 minutes later when Vought's cleanup team arrived. They found America's greatest hero, kneeling in a destroyed lab cape pooled around him, eyes unfocused. When they asked what happened, he didn't answer. Ashley would put it in a report as temporary disorientation from unknown soup ability. But Homelander knew what it was. For the first time in his life, someone had looked at him and seen exactly what he was. Not a god, not a hero, just a product that believed its own advertising. And he had no idea how to fight that. Billy Butcher got the call from Raynor at 8:15 a.m., which meant she'd been sitting on intel for at least an hour before deciding whether to burn him with it. That was how their relationship worked. She fed him scraps. He did the bleeding she couldn't authorize. Sage Grove, she said without preamble. Something went wrong with the trial. Homelander went in 90 minutes ago. He hasn't come out. Butcher leaned back in his chair boots, propped on the desk of their current safe house, a condemned building in Newark that smelled like mold and broken dreams. And you're telling me this, why? Because whatever walked out of that facility isn't in our database. Because Vought has gone radio silent. And because I need eyes on this before it becomes a problem I can't contain. You mean before it becomes a problem you can't spin? Raynor's silence was answer enough. Butcher looked across the room to where Huey sat hunched over a laptop trying to crack Vaught's latest encryption protocol with software that was 2 years out of date. The kid was getting better at the technical work, but he still had the posture of someone who expected the world to kick him in the teeth. What's the pay? Butcher asked. Information. Medical records on your wife. Pre-injection baseline neurological scans, the works. Butcher's boots hit the floor. Bullshit. You don't have access to that. I will, if this stays quiet, Raynor said. Sage Grove is off the books. No congressional oversight, no internal review. Whatever happened there, Vought wants it buried. That gives me leverage, but only if I know what I'm leveraging. Butcher stood and walked to the window. Outside Newark went about its morning oblivious to the fact that somewhere in Pennsylvania, something had made Homelander hesitate. That alone was worth the risk. We'll need Temp V, he said. Can't authorize it. Then we'll nick it ourselves. You want recon, you pay for the tools. Raynor hung up. Butcher pocketed his phone and looked at Huey. Pack your kit. We're going to Pennsylvania. Huey glanced up, eyes red from screen glare. What's in Pennsylvania? Either opportunity or a fucking disaster. Won't know till we get there. Frenchie emerged from the back room, wiping grease off his hands with a rag that was dirtier than his skin. Pennsylvania. This is about the Sage Grove situation, yes? The one on the chatterboards. Chatterboards, Butcher said. Reddit, Twitter. A nurse posted 15 minutes ago that she saw Homelander land at Sage Grove and hasn't seen him leave. The post was deleted, which means it was true. Frenchie grinned. Also means someone is scared. Walked in from the kitchen, a cup of coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. I'm not doing this. Whatever this is, I'm out. You haven't even heard the pitch, Butcher said. Don't need to. You've got that look. The one that says you're about to get us all killed for a chance to hurt Homelander. Set down his coffee with deliberate care. I got a daughter. I got a life I'm trying to rebuild. I'm done. Butcher met his eyes. They'd had this conversation before in different words, same outcome. Always drew his line, and Butcher always crossed it anyway. Fair enough, Butcher said. Huey, Frenchie, load up. We leave in 20. Shook his head and walked out. The drive to Sage Grove took 3 hours. Butcher pushed the van hard, ignoring speed limits and Huey's white-knuckled grip on the door handle. Frenchie rode in the back, assembling surveillance equipment and humming something French and melancholy. What's the plan? Huey asked as they crossed into Pennsylvania. Get in. See what made Homelander blink. Get out. That's not a plan. That's a suicide note. Butcher glanced at him. You didn't have to come. Yeah, I did. Huey looked out the window. Rayner said something walked out of Sage Grove. Something new. If Vaught's making more soups, we need to know what we're up against. The kid was learning. Butcher wasn't sure if that was good or bad. They parked 2 miles from Sage Grove and approached on foot, moving through woods that had gone wild from neglect. Frenchie led scanning for security with equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Huey followed, trying not to trip over roots. Butcher brought up the rear, one hand on the Glock at his hip. The facility loomed ahead, all concrete and reinforced glass, pretending to be a hospital. Butcher had read the leaked files on Sage Grove. It was where Vought tested Compound 5 on adults, which meant it was where people went to become weapons or corpses. The success rate was roughly 30%. The files didn't mention what happened to the 70% who failed. No exterior guards, Frenchie whispered. No patrols. Either they evacuated or something very bad has occurred. Both, Butcher said. Move. They breached through a service entrance Frenchie had marked on stolen schematics. The door was unlocked. Inside, the hallways were empty and lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in red. Huey pulled out his phone, activating the camera. We should document this. No phones, Butcher said. No trail. They moved deeper into the facility clearing rooms with practiced efficiency. Offices sat abandoned computers, still running. A cafeteria had trays of food going cold. In one hallway, they found a security guard sitting against the wall, staring at nothing. Frenchie checked his pulse. Alive. In shock, I think. He's not seeing us. Butcher crouched in front of the guard. Oi. What happened here? The guard's eyes didn't focus. His lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Butcher leaned closer. He's in my head, the guard whispered. I shot Danny. I didn't want to. But he made me. He's still in my head. Butcher straightened. Telepath. Vought already has telepaths, Huey said. Why would this one be different? Because Homelander wouldn't run from a fucking mind reader. They found the main lab on the second floor. The door was torn off its hinges, metal bent like foil. Inside, the space looked like a bomb had gone off. Shattered equipment, scorch marks on the walls. And in the center, sitting calmly in a chair, was a man in a hospital gown. He looked up when they entered. His expression was neutral, assessing. You're not with Vought. Butcher raised the Glock. Hands where I can see them. The man complied, placing his hands on his knees. You came looking for answers, That's smarter than the other one. Other one, Huey said. The man in the red and blue costume. He came to establish dominance. You came to understand. The man tilted his head. Why? Butcher kept the gun steady. Because understanding is how you kill things. The man smiled slightly. It wasn't a warm expression. Honest. I appreciate that. He gestured at the destroyed lab. This is what your world calls progress. Inflict suffering until you extract power. Repeat until profitable. Spare me the philosophy, Butcher said. What are you? An accident. A mutation. A question your science wasn't prepared to answer. The man stood slowly, hands still visible. V-Null was designed to suppress abilities. Instead, it created something that operates on principles your framework doesn't recognize. Frenchie whispered, Butcher, we should leave. Not yet. Butcher took a step closer. You scared Homelander. I want to know how. I showed him the truth, the man said simply. That he's a product designed for consumption. That his power is the theater. That everything he believes about himself is marketing. Butcher felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd spent years trying to hurt Homelander to find the crack in the Golden God's armor. And this stranger had done it in one conversation. Can you kill him? Butcher asked. Yes. Will you? The man considered this. Why would I? Because he's a monster. Because he's murdered innocent people. Because the world would be better without him. Would it? The man walked toward them, and Butcher noticed Huey backing up, noticed Frenchie's hand moving toward his weapon. But Butcher held his ground. If I kill him, Vought makes another. If I kill Vought, the government makes another. The problem isn't the weapon. It's the people who keep building them. So, what you're going to fix society, Butcher said. Good fucking luck. No, the man said. I'm going to make them understand that they've already destroyed it. He moved his hand, a gesture so slight, Butcher almost missed it. And the world changed. Butcher was standing in a cemetery. Rain fell in sheets cold and relentless. A coffin was being lowered into the ground, and he recognized the mourners. His father. His mother. Lenny. No, not Lenny. Lenny was buried years ago. He looked at the coffin and saw the nameplate. Rebecca Butcher. This isn't real, he said. It could be, said a voice beside him. Butcher turned. The man from the lab stood next to him wearing a black suit instead of a hospital gown. He looked at the funeral with mild interest. Your wife, the man said. Held captive by Homelander, used, broken, and you couldn't save her. Shut your fucking mouth. But what if you could? The man gestured and the scene shifted. Butcher stood in Vought Tower. Homelander was on his knees, cape-torn face bloodied. Butcher held a gun to his head. Around them, Vought executives were on their knees, two hands bound. The media was broadcasting everything. The world was watching. You won, the man said. You exposed them, broke them, made them pay for every life they destroyed. Butcher pulled the trigger. Homelander's head snapped back. He fell. The room erupted in screams and chaos, but Butcher didn't care. He'd done it. Finally. After years of blood and rage and loss, he'd made the bastard pay. He looked at his hands. They were steady, clean. This was justice. The man appeared in front of him. How does it feel? Fucking brilliant, Butcher said. Look again. Butcher looked down. Homelander's body was gone. In its place was Rebecca, eyes open, bullet hole between them. Butcher stumbled backward. No, that's not. You wanted to kill him so badly you didn't check who you were aiming at, the man said. Revenge makes people blind. You think you're fighting for her. But you stopped seeing her years ago. All you see now is your own pain. The scene shattered. Butcher was back in the lab on his knees, gun on the floor beside him. Huey was shouting something. Frenchie had his weapon drawn, but wasn't firing. The man stood over Butcher, expression unchanged. You're useful, motivated. You understand that power is violence with better branding. But you're not my ally. You're just another broken piece of a broken system. Butcher grabbed his gun and fired. The bullet stopped 6 inches from the man's chest, hanging in the air like a mosquito in amber. It fell to the ground with a soft clink. I don't need allies, the man said. I need this world to understand what it's built. You can help with that or not. The outcome is the same. He walked past them toward the door. Wait, Huey said. What are you going to do? The man paused. Show people what they've been worshiping. Then let them decide if they want to keep the altar. He left. Butcher stayed on the floor, breathing hard, trying to shake the image of Rebecca with a bullet between her eyes. His hands were shaking. His hands never shook. Frenchie helped him up. Mon ami, we need to leave. Now. Yeah, Butcher said quietly. We do. They stumbled out of the facility and into the woods. Behind them, Sage Grove sat silent and empty, a monument to science without ethics. Ahead, somewhere in the world, a man who could break minds was loose. Butcher had wanted to hurt Homelander, had wanted anyone to make the bastards suffer. He'd gotten his wish, and he realized with creeping certainty that he'd just made everything infinitely worse. In the van heading back to Newark, Huey finally spoke. What did you see in there? What did he show you? Butcher stared at the road. The future I've been chasing. Turned out it was a fucking nightmare. So what do? Same thing we always do, Butcher said. We survive, and we try to stop the world from ending. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if that was possible anymore. The emergency board meeting at Vought Tower began at 2:47 p.m. with 18 executives and ended at 2:51 p.m. when Ashley Barrett received a text message that made her vomit into a trash can. He's here, she managed, phone shaking in her hand. He's in the building. Stan Edgar, CEO, and the only person in the room who looked like he'd slept in the past 48 hours, leaned forward. Clarify. The Sage Grove subject. Security flagged him entering through the parking garage 17 minutes ago. He walked past 6 checkpoints. No one stopped him. They're saying they didn't see him. That's impossible, said someone from legal. He's a telepath, Ashley said. Or something close enough that it doesn't matter. He got past Homelander. He got past armed security. And now he's in our building. Stan Edgar stood. He buttoned his suit jacket with the calm of a man who had prepared for exactly this scenario. Lockdown protocol. Seal all floors. Alert the 7. Get every available soup to the broadcast center. Why the broadcast center? Ashley asked. Edgar looked at her with something approaching pity. Because that's where we're most vulnerable. That's where we tell the world who we are. And if he understands anything about Vought, he understands that. He was right. 3 floors down, in the glossy nerve center where Vought's media empire operated 24 hours a day, a man in stolen maintenance coveralls walked through corridors that should have been locked. The security systems registered his presence. The cameras tracked his movement. Alerts fired to central monitoring, and every single person who received those alerts forgot them 3 seconds later. The man who called himself Nothing walked with purpose but without haste. He had studied this building's layout through the scattered memories of everyone he'd encountered since leaving Sage Grove. Ashley's panic. Homelander's ego-driven tours. Security guards who knew every blind spot and weak point. The broadcast center was a cathedral to manufactured truth. 3 studios, 200 personnel, enough technology to reach 3 billion people simultaneously. It was here that Vought shaped reality, deciding which soups were heroes and which were cautionary tales, which crises were real and which were marketing opportunities. The man entered Studio A through a maintenance door that unlocked itself at his approach. Inside, a crew of 40 prepared for the 5 p.m. VNN broadcast, the one where the 7 would address recent concerns about soup accountability following a tragic accident in Cincinnati. The script had been focus tested. The lighting was perfect. Everything was under control. The man walked onto the set. "Excuse me," said a production assistant, stepping forward with a clipboard and the confident irritation of someone used to unauthorized people wandering where they didn't belong. "This is a closed set. You need to—" She stopped. Her eyes went unfocused for a moment, then cleared. She smiled apologetically and walked back to her station. The man moved to the central console where 3 technicians monitored everything from audio levels to social media sentiment in real time. He placed his hand on the primary computer terminal. The screens flickered. The technicians didn't notice. They kept working, kept adjusting their controls, kept preparing for a broadcast that had already changed in ways they would not understand until it was far too late. In the green room adjacent to Studio A, the 7 sat in various states of preparation. A-Train adjusted his costume, checking his reflection for the 15th time. The Deep practiced his smile, the one that tested well with coastal demographics. Black Noir stood silent in the corner as always. Starlight reviewed her talking points, highlighting passages that felt authentic enough to deliver without choking. Homelander sat apart from them, cape draped over his chair, staring at nothing. Ashley burst in. 2 minutes. We're live in 2 minutes. Homelander, you're on first. The opener is about Cincinnati, pivot to Vaught's commitment to oversight, then introduce Starlight for the... I'm not doing it, Homelander said. Ashley's momentum died. What? I said I'm not doing it. Homelander's voice was flat, stripped of its usual performance. Get someone else. There is no someone else. You're the face of the 7. You're a product. Homelander looked at her. His eyes were wrong, Ashley thought. Missing something essential. That's what he said. I'm a product designed for consumption. And he was right. Who said that? Ashley asked, though she already knew. The thing from Sage Grove. Homelander stood, but the movement lacked his usual predatory grace. He got in my head. He showed me. It doesn't matter. I'm not going on camera. We're live in 90 seconds, Ashley said, voice climbing toward hysteria. The board is watching. Advertisers are watching. The goddamn president is watching. You will get on that stage and you will smile and you will... Homelander grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off the ground. The other soups tensed. Starlight's hands began to glow. A-Train shifted into a runner's stance. The Deep backed toward the door. Tell me I'm not a product, Homelander said quietly. Tell me I'm real. That I matter beyond quarterly earnings. Tell me, Ashley. Ashley couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Her hands clawed at his wrist uselessly. "That's what I thought," Homelander said, and dropped her. She hit the floor, gasping. Homelander walked out. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed the lights in the green room begin to flicker in a pattern that should have been random, but wasn't. No one noticed the air conditioning kick into a higher cycle, spreading something invisible through the ventilation system. No one noticed that they were breathing in trace amounts of a compound that shouldn't exist, designed in a lab that would soon be erased from all records. The compound did nothing on its own. It was simply a catalyst, making neurons slightly more receptive to certain wavelengths of electromagnetic interference. The kind of interference that a sufficiently advanced biofield could generate. Studio A went live at 5 p.m. exactly. The cameras activated. The lights came up. The director, still unaware that anything was wrong, cued the opening sequence. VNN's logo appeared on 300 million screens across America and another 2 billion worldwide. Theme music played. The stage was set. Homelander walked out to applause from the studio audience. He smiled, waved, hit his mark with practiced precision. Everything looked normal. But in the control room, the man in maintenance coveralls stood behind the technicians and began to work. His biofield expanded, touching every piece of electronic equipment in the studio. Camera sensors, audio feeds, the broadcast stream itself. He did not control them. He did not need to. He simply introduced interference, tiny fluctuations that human perception would interpret as glitches or static or nothing at all. But neural tissue primed by the catalyst compound would interpret differently. Homelander opened his mouth to speak, reading from the teleprompter. "Good evening, America. I want to address the tragic events in Cincinnati and assure you that..." His voice cracked. "Not much. Just a slight waver, barely noticeable." But the audience heard it as something else entirely. They heard fear, uncertainty, the sound of someone reading lines they didn't believe. Homelander frowned, glanced at the teleprompter, and tried again. "Vought International remains committed to..." The lights flickered. It was subtle, lasting less than a second. But in that moment, the studio audience saw something different. They saw the stage for what it was. The backdrop wasn't patriotic grandeur. It was cheap, painted canvas. The lighting wasn't heroic. It was theatrical, designed to hide flaws. And Homelander, standing center stage in his bright costume, looked less like a god and more like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Starlight walked out for her segment, hitting her mark beside Homelander. She was supposed to talk about Vaught's new transparency initiative, a program designed by PR to sound meaningful while committing to nothing. She knew her lines, had rehearsed them until they sounded natural. But when she opened her mouth, something happened to the sound. The microphones picked up not just her words, but the strain behind them, the effort of maintaining the performance. And the audience, influenced by the compound and the interference, heard something underneath her practiced delivery. They heard a young woman terrified of saying the wrong thing. "Vought has always prioritized..." Starlight paused just for a moment, and the audience saw her eyes move to the camera, then away. Saw her swallow. Saw the micro-expression of someone trapped. The safety of American citizens. A-Train came out next, moving at normal speed, because his heart couldn't handle the alternative anymore. The studio audience knew this. The world knew this. But Vaught's narrative said he was recovering, getting stronger still. The 7 Speedster, when he stood under the lights, breathing hard from the 20-foot walk to his mark, the interference made everyone see it clearly. Not a hero. A man whose body was failing, propped up by stimulants and desperation and a contract he couldn't afford to break. The Deep delivered his lines about Vought's oceanographic research programs. Starlight talked about community outreach. Black Noir stood silent because that was his entire personality, a marketing decision that had tested well in the 18 to 34 demographic. And through it all, the man in the control room maintained the interference. It was not dramatic, no explosions, no screams, just a subtle shift in perception that made the studio audience and everyone watching at home see the performance for what it was. See the strain, the fear, the exhaustion, the desperate effort to maintain a narrative that was crumbling in real time. Ashley watched from the wing's phone pressed to her ear, fielding calls from board members who were watching the broadcast and trying to understand why it felt wrong, why the seven filmed and lit and directed exactly as they always were suddenly looked like actors in a high school play. "Fix it!" a board member screamed in her ear. "I don't care how. Fix it right now." But Ashley didn't know what there was to fix. Everything was operating normally. The cameras were working. The lights were fine. The script was being followed. And yet something fundamental had broken. In homes across America, people watched the seven deliver their prepared statements and felt something they'd never quite articulated before. The careful choreography of it. The way every word was selected for maximum palatability. The way these supposed heroes never said anything real, anything spontaneous, anything that hadn't been vetted by 6 different departments. They were watching a commercial, pretending to be truth. The broadcast continued for 18 more minutes. The seven hit every mark delivered, every line smiled on cue. And with each passing moment, the audience saw more clearly, saw the exhaustion on Starlight's face, saw the tremor in A-Train's legs, saw the way Homelander's smile never quite reached his eyes, saw that they'd been sold gods and received products. When the broadcast finally ended, Ashley stood in the control room and watched the social media numbers crater in real time. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once, like a dam breaking. Vought lies began trending. Videos of the broadcast were being dissected frame by frame. Journalists were already writing think pieces about manufactured heroism and corporate manipulation. The seven's approval rating dropped 14 points in 20 minutes. Ashley turned to scream at anyone, and saw him. The man in maintenance coveralls stood by the door watching the monitors with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. When he noticed her looking, he nodded once like a colleague acknowledging work well done. Then he walked out. Ashley tried to follow, but her legs wouldn't move. She stood frozen, watching him disappear down the corridor, knowing she should call security, but unable to remember why. By the time she could move again, he was gone. The emergency board meeting reconvened at 6:03 p.m. Stan Edgar stood at the head of the table looking at a room full of people who had just watched their most valuable assets destroy themselves on live television. "How?" someone from marketing asked. "What the hell just happened?" "We were attacked," Edgar said calmly. "Not with weapons, with perception. Someone made our audience see what was always there. The infrastructure, the control, the fact that we've been selling them a story." "Can we spin this?" Legal asked. "No." Edgar's certainty was absolute. "We can't spin the truth. We can only try to rebuild around it." A board member stood up. "Then we need to find whoever did this. Find them and what?" Edgar said. "Kill them that makes them a martyr. Discredit them on what grounds they didn't lie. They didn't manipulate footage. They simply made people see clearly." He paused. "The problem isn't what they did. The problem is what we built." The room fell silent. Edgar looked at the monitors showing the social media firestorm, The news coverage, the public turning against the narrative they'd been fed for decades. Vought has operated on the principle that we control the story. As of tonight, that's no longer true. We need to prepare for a world where our products are questioned instead of worshipped. How do we do that? Ashley asked. Edgar met her eyes. I have no idea. In a supply closet 3 floors down, the man who had destroyed a billion-dollar brand without throwing a single punch stripped off his stolen coveralls and dressed in clothes he'd taken from a locker room. Jeans, a black shirt, a jacket that would help him blend into a city full of people. He left Vought Tower through the loading dock, walking past security, who glanced at him and immediately looked away, their brains unable to hold on to his presence for more than a few seconds. Outside New York went about its evening. People walked past him on the sidewalk, seeing but not seeing, aware of his presence but unable to focus on it. He was a gap in perception, a blind spot that moved through the city like a ghost. He had shown them the stage, the lights, the performance. Now they would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. And he had a feeling they would not choose wisdom. Homelander found him on the roof of Vought Tower at 11:34 p.m. The city sprawled below them, a grid of lights and noise, and 8 million people who had spent the evening tearing apart everything Homelander represented. The social media numbers were still falling. News anchors were calling for investigations. A senator from California had already scheduled emergency hearings. The man stood at the edge of the roof, looking down at the city with the same detached interest he'd shown everything else. He'd changed clothes, jeans and a dark jacket like any other, nobody trying to disappear into the urban sprawl. Homelander landed 15 feet behind him. His cape snapped in the wind that howled across the rooftop. His eyes were already glowing red. I should have killed you at Sage Grove, Homelander said. The man turned. His expression was calm. But you didn't. I'm fixing that mistake. Homelander's heat vision lanced out twin beams of concentrated energy that could cut through a tank. The man raised his hand, and that impossible barrier materialized, the fractured light construct that bent physics in ways that made Homelander's vision ache. The beams scattered, dispersing harmlessly into the night sky. You're still trying to win through force, the man said. That's your only language. Dominate or be dominated. Homelander cut the beams and moved, closing the distance faster than human eyes could track. His fist drove toward the man's face with enough force to shatter concrete. The barrier held. The impact sent a shockwave across the rooftop that shattered windows and set off car alarms 6 blocks away. Homelander struck again and again. Each blow was a thunderclap. Each one failed to land. You destroyed everything, Homelander said between strikes. My image, my team, your performance. The man interrupted. I destroyed your performance. The real you was always there. People just couldn't see it through all the production value. Homelander grabbed for the man's throat. His hands closed on the barrier, and for a moment he felt resistance. Real solid resistance. He poured everything into it, every ounce of his genetically engineered strength, trying to crush this obstruction through sheer overwhelming power. The barrier held. You're a god, Homelander snarled. That's what they called me. What they were supposed to keep calling me. And you took that away. They called you a god because Vought paid them to, the man said. His voice remained level, undisturbed by Homelander's assault. Because focus groups responded well to divine imagery. Because it helped quarterly earnings. You were never a god. You were a quarterly report that could fly. Homelander roared and unleashed his heat vision again, not at the man, but at the roof beneath his feet. The concrete exploded, sending debris flying. The man fell with the collapsing surface, and Homelander dove after him, determined to catch him mid-fall where there would be no solid ground to brace against. He tackled the man in midair, driving them both toward the street 50 stories below. The wind screamed past them. The ground rushed up. At the last second, Homelander arrested their fall, stopping them both 3 feet above the pavement in a display of precision flying that would have made for excellent footage. There were no cameras. No one was watching. And Homelander realized he'd performed anyway, muscle memory from 1,000 photo shoots, overwhelming tactical sense. The man looked at him. Even now, even when you're trying to kill me, you're still performing. Homelander slammed him into the street. The pavement cracked. Car alarms shrieked, people screamed and ran. Homelander pinned the man down, hands around his throat, squeezing with enough pressure to collapse steel. "I'm going to kill you," Homelander said, "and then I'm going to kill everyone who saw that broadcast. I'm going to make them remember that I'm—" "What?" the man said. His voice was unchanged despite the pressure on his throat, despite being pinned beneath someone who could bench press a bus. "What are you, Homelander? Say it. Without the script, without the talking points. What are you?" Homelander's hands tightened. "Afraid," the man said quietly. "You're afraid? Because for the first time in your life, someone saw you completely. And you can't kill that. Can't bury it. Can't spin it into something comfortable." Homelander released him and stood backing away. His breathing was ragged. His hands were shaking again, just like they had in the lab at Sage Grove. The man rose to his feet. Dust and debris fell from his jacket, but there were no injuries, no bruises, no sign that he'd just been driven through pavement by the world's strongest soup. "You want me to fight you," the man said, "to make this about strength, because that's the only hierarchy you understand. But I'm not here to prove I'm stronger than you." "Then what the hell do you want?" Homelander shouted. The man looked up at the sky. "To show this world what it's built, and what that costs." He closed his eyes. Homelander felt it before he saw it. A change in air pressure, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The people still on the street stopped running and looked up. In the sky above Manhattan, something was forming. It started as a distortion, a ripple in the darkness where stars should have been visible. Then the distortion solidified, took shape, became massive and undeniable. A chunk of rock and earth torn from somewhere that made no sense. Pulled into existence through principles that violated every law of physics Vaught's scientists had ever cataloged. The object was the size of a city block, maybe larger. It was difficult to judge scale when looking at something that shouldn't exist. Something that the human brain kept trying to rationalize as a cloud or a building or anything other than what it was. A meteor, hanging in the sky above the most populated city in America. Not falling. Not yet. Just suspended there, blocking out the moon, casting a shadow that turned entire neighborhoods dark. Homelander stared. For a moment his mind went blank, wiped clean by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. Then training kicked in, the protocols drilled into him since childhood, and he lifted off the ground, preparing to intercept the object before it fell. "Don't," the man said. Homelander stopped, hovered, looked down at the man who stood calmly in the crater they'd made in the street. "If you touch it, I drop it," the man said. "If you attack me, I drop it. If anyone tries to evacuate the city, I drop it." He paused. Do you understand? You're insane, Homelander said. There are 8 million people down there. I know. I can feel them. Every heartbeat, every breath. Every person who watched your performance tonight and started to question the narrative they've been sold. The man looked up at his creation. This isn't a weapon. It's a statement. Statement of what? That your power is permission, not a right, not a gift from God or science or destiny. The man's voice carried across the empty street with perfect clarity. You fly because no one has forced you to stay grounded. You kill because no one has made you stop. You terrorize because the cost of stopping you seems higher than the cost of letting you continue. So what, you're going to drop that thing to prove a point? Homelander gestured at the sky. Kill millions to teach them a lesson about power? No. The man smiled slightly. It was not a kind expression. I'm going to hold it there until you understand that I could. Until every person in this city understands that their safety is a choice someone made, not an inevitability. Until Vought understands that the gods they manufactured can be unmade by something they can't control or commodify or spin into profit. Homelander looked around. The street was empty now, everyone having fled or hidden. But he could hear them. Millions of heartbeats, elevated by fear. Could hear the sirens starting across the city, the emergency broadcasts, the panic spreading like wildfire. Could hear somewhere in the distance news helicopters approaching to film whatever this was. You wanted me to fight you, the man said. Here's your fight. Save them. Move the meteor. Be the hero they're paying you to be. Homelander flew at the suspended mass. His hand struck stone that felt too solid, too real. He pushed, straining against impossible weight. The meteor didn't budge. He repositioned, trying to find leverage where there was none, and pushed harder. His muscles screamed. His vision blurred. Heat vision scored the surface, cutting trenches that glowed orange, and did nothing to reduce the mass. He might as well have been trying to move a mountain by shoving it. Below, the man watched without comment. Homelander descended, landing hard enough to crack more pavement. You're killing people. Right now. The panic alone will kill fewer than you have, the man interrupted. How many people have died because Homelander was there to save them and chose not to? How many have died because saving them wasn't profitable? Because the optics were bad? Because you were having a moment? That's different. Is it? The man took a step forward. I can feel their deaths, Homelander. Every life you've ended. Every person you let die when you could have saved them. 47. That's the number. 47 people dead because America's greatest hero decided they weren't worth the effort. You don't know what you're talking about. I know that you let a woman in Cincinnati burn to death because saving her would have revealed you caused the fire in the first place. I know you let a flight attendant die after your ego destroyed a plane. I know you. Homelander's heat vision cut him off twin beams of rage and desperation and fear. The barrier held. The beams scattered, and high above the meteor remained suspended, casting its shadow over millions of lives. This is what power looks like, the man said. Not your costume, not your smile, not the carefully crafted image of control. This, the moment when someone holds millions of lives in their hands and everyone realizes that safety was always an illusion. So you're just going to hold the city hostage for what? To make a point. To make sure the point is heard. The man looked up at the meteor. Vought built gods to control people. I'm showing them that their gods are props. Expensive, dangerous props, but props nonetheless. And props can be replaced. Homelander followed his gaze. The meteor hung there silent and enormous and undeniable. News helicopters were circling it now, cameras broadcasting to the world. He could imagine the footage. The panic, the questions, the demands for explanations that Vought couldn't provide. "They'll hate you for this," Homelander said. "They already hate what I represent. They just don't know it yet." The man started walking, heading down the empty street. "You can stay here and try to be the hero. Pretend you're protecting them from me. Or you can go back to Vought and start asking the questions you've been avoiding." "What questions?" The man stopped, looked back. "Whether you're a person or a product. Whether you matter beyond your market value. Whether any of this was ever real." He continued walking, disappearing into the darkness between streetlights. Homelander wanted to chase him, to grab him, to force him to bring down the meteor and end this nightmare. But he couldn't move, could only stand in the middle of an empty street, looking up at the impossible object hanging over the city, and realized that for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. The meteor stayed there for 6 hours. It hung above Manhattan like a second moon, visible from 3 states, dominating every news cycle and social media feed on the planet. Vought scrambled. The government scrambled. Scientists gave interviews about how it defied physics. Analysts gave interviews about terrorism and superhuman threats. Religious leaders gave interviews about signs and apocalypse. No one gave interviews about why it was there. At 5:47 a.m., as dawn began to light the eastern sky, the meteor began to dissolve. Not fall, not explode. It simply came apart, breaking into particles too small to see dispersing on the wind like smoke. Within 10 minutes, there was nothing left but clear sky and the memory of impossible weight. But the damage was done. Homelander stood on the roof of Vought Tower, watching the dissolution, and knew that nothing would ever be the same. The world had seen their heroes fail, had seen something they couldn't explain, couldn't fight, couldn't spin into a comfortable narrative, had seen that safety was a choice, not a guarantee. And they had seen Homelander, America's greatest hero, standing beneath a meteor he couldn't move, looking up at his own impotence. Below in the streets, people emerged from hiding. They looked at each other, at the empty sky, at the towers where soups lived and corporations made gods. And they began to ask questions that Vought had spent billions, making sure they never thought to ask. Questions about power, about control, about who really decided who lived and who died in a world where the strong could do whatever they wanted and the weak could only hope they chose mercy. Homelander heard them asking, 8 million voices rising in confusion and anger and fear. And he knew with absolute certainty that the man had been right. The performance was over. Now came the reckoning. The emergency session of Congress convened at 9 a.m., 6 hours after the meteor dissolved, and 3 hours after the first suicide. A man in Detroit had jumped from his apartment building, leaving behind a note that said he couldn't live in a world where gods could be made obsolete overnight. The news buried the story within an hour, but the internet found it amplified. It turned it into a symbol for something larger that no one could quite articulate. Representative Victoria Newman stood at the podium, facing a chamber full of terrified legislators who suddenly understood that all their careful oversight committees and soup regulation bills had been theater. The man who had held Manhattan hostage hadn't been registered, hadn't been tested, hadn't been on anyone's radar until he decided to make himself known. "We need to discuss proportional response," Newman said, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who knew the cameras were always watching. What happened last night was an act of terrorism, an attack on American soil. We have protocols for this. Protocols for what? Senator Morrison from Iowa stood face red with the kind of anger that comes from fear. For a man who can materialize meteors, who can walk through our most secure facilities without being seen, who can destroy $100 billion brand with one broadcast. "We have Soups," someone said. "We have Homelander." The chamber went quiet. Everyone had seen the footage. Homelander standing beneath the suspended mass, powerless. Homelander, who had spent a decade being sold as America's ultimate defense, reduced to a spectator, while something incomprehensible rewrote the rules. "Where is Homelander now?" Morrison asked. No one answered, because no one knew. Homelander was in the sub-basement of Vought Tower, 3 floors below ground, in a room designed to contain him if he ever lost control completely. The walls were reinforced steel. The ceiling could deploy gas within seconds. The door required 3 separate authorization codes to open. He hadn't asked to be there. He'd walked in himself at 6:22 a.m. and told Ashley to lock it behind him. She'd complied because she didn't know what else to do. Now she stood outside the door with Stan Edgar, both of them staring at the reinforced barrier and trying to pretend this was manageable. "He's having a breakdown," Ashley said. "A complete psychological collapse. We need to get him help, therapy, medication, something." "What he needs," Edgar said calmly, "is to not exist for the next 72 hours while we figure out how to spin this." "You can't spin this." Ashley's voice cracked. She'd been awake for 36 hours, running on coffee and terror. The world watched our flagship product fail. They watched him stand there looking helpless while some nobody held a city hostage. "How do we spin that?" Edgar turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone and decades of corporate survival. "We don't. We accept the loss, cut our exposure, and move to the next quarter." "Cut our exposure? Homelander is Vought. He's 80% of our revenue stream. He's compromised," Edgar finished. "Psychologically damaged beyond immediate repair. And now, a liability that costs more than he generates." He adjusted his cufflinks with the same care he brought to everything. "We have other assets. A-Train can be rebuilt. Starlight is still viable with the right coaching. We develop new products. We adapt." Ashley stared at him. "You're talking about replacing Homelander." "I'm talking about acknowledging reality." Edgar started walking toward the elevator. "The man who did this proved something we've spent decades trying to hide. Soups aren't invincible. They're not even particularly special. They're just enhanced humans with excellent marketing. And once the public understands that, the entire business model collapses. So what do we do?" Edgar pressed the button for the executive floor. "We prepare for a market correction, and we make sure we're the ones who profit from it." The elevator doors closed, leaving Ashley alone in the corridor. She looked at the reinforced door, imagining Homelander sitting in that cell, and wondered if this was what winning looked like when there were no good options left. Billy Butcher sat in a diner in Newark, watching the news coverage on a mounted television that was older than Huey. The volume was off, but the images told the story. The meteor. Homelander looking up, the chaos, the questions. Huey sat across from him, picking at pancakes he wasn't eating. "We should do something." "Like what?" Butcher said. "I don't know. Find him. Stop him. He held 8 million people hostage, Butcher. That's not justice. That's terrorism. Terrorism's just war without a uniform, kid." Butcher took a drink of coffee that tasted like burnt tire rubber. And he didn't kill anyone? Didn't even hurt anyone, far as we can tell. Just scared the piss out of them and made them ask questions. Questions about what? About who's really in charge, about whether the soups we've been told to worship are actually worth a damn. Butcher gestured at the television. He did more damage to Vought in one night than we've managed in 5 years. Made the whole bloody empire look like a house of cards. So you're on his side now. I'm not on anyone's side. Butcher set down his cup hard enough to rattle the saucer. But I'm not stupid enough to think stopping him makes things better. He's right, Huey. Everything he said about Vought, about Homelander, about the whole rotten system, he's fucking right. That doesn't mean what he did was okay. No. Butcher agreed. It just means we've been fighting the wrong war. Frenchie entered the diner, moving with the nervous energy of someone who'd been monitoring police scanners for 12 hours straight. He slid into the booth beside Huey. The authorities are losing their minds, he said in a low voice. FBI, CIA, NSA, everyone with an acronym is trying to find this man. But they have nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no facial recognition matches. It is as if he does not exist in any database. Because he doesn't, Butcher said. He's not a soup they made and lost track of. He's something new, something they didn't plan for and can't control. Which makes him more dangerous than Homelander, Huey said. Does it? Butcher looked at him. Homelander's killed hundreds, tortured, raped, done every evil thing a man with power can do to people without it. And we've all just lived with it, because stopping him seemed impossible. This bloke holds a city hostage for 6 hours, doesn't kill anyone. And suddenly he's the biggest threat. Huey didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, none of them did. They'd spent years fighting Vought's manufactured gods, and now something that wasn't manufactured, wasn't controlled, wasn't part of any system they understood had proven that the gods were hollow. And instead of feeling like victory, it felt like standing on a cliff edge, waiting for the ground to give way. What do we do? Huey asked quietly. Butcher looked at the television, at the images of people in the streets confused and angry and afraid, at the politicians scrambling to maintain control, at the reporters trying to explain something that made no sense within their frameworks. We wait, Butcher said, because whatever comes next, it's already in motion, and we're too small to stop it. In a hotel room in Queens, paid for with cash from a wallet he'd taken from someone who wouldn't miss it for hours. The man sat cross-legged on the bed and listened to the city, not with his ears. With the neural field that extended from his body, like invisible fingers touching the bioelectric signatures of 8 million people trying to process what had happened. Their fear, their anger, their questions, their doubt. He could feel Homelander in his cell spiraling through cycles of rage and despair and confusion. Could feel Ashley standing outside that cell wondering if her career was over. Could feel Stan Edgar in his office already calculating the next move in a game that had changed rules. Could feel Butcher in his diner caught between vindication and dread. Could feel all of them, every person in this city, beginning to understand that the world they thought they knew had been a carefully maintained fiction. He had not come here to destroy. Despite what they thought, despite what they feared, destruction had never been the goal. He had come to expose, to make visible the infrastructure that held their reality together, to force them to see the bars of the cage they'd been living in. What they did with that knowledge was their choice. He stood and walked to the window. Dawn was fully broken now, light spreading across a city that looked the same as it had yesterday, but fundamentally wasn't. The performance was over. The stage was visible. And everyone was staring at the revealed machinery, trying to decide if they wanted to fix it or burn it down. Both options would lead to suffering. He knew this. Had lived through cycles of violence and peace, and violence again, each one born from the same fundamental problem. People with power convincing themselves that power made them right. This world had made gods out of genetics and corporate investment, had sold the illusion that strength equaled virtue, that power equaled protection, had built an entire civilization on the premise that as long as the strong were properly managed, the weak would be safe. He had proven that premise false, and now they would have to reckon with what that meant. The man picked up the jacket he'd stolen, checked the pockets to make sure they were empty, and prepared to leave. There was nothing more to do here. Manhattan had learned its lesson. Vought had learned its lesson. The heroes they'd worshipped had learned they were products, not gods. What happened next was up to them. He walked out of the hotel into morning light, just another person in a city of millions, invisible by choice rather than necessity. Behind him in boardrooms and bunkers and government offices, people were making decisions about how to respond to him, whether to hunt him, negotiate with him, try to understand him. None of it mattered. He had not come to be caught or reasoned with or understood. He had come to crack the foundation, to make them see the rot they'd built their world upon, to force the question they'd spent decades avoiding. If power is just permission from those too weak to refuse, what happens when they start refusing? The answer was already unfolding, in the streets, in the news cycles, in the conversations happening across 8 million dinner tables where people who'd never questioned superheroes before were suddenly asking why they'd trusted them at all. The man walked through Queens toward the subway, and the city moved around him, changed and changing, afraid of what came next, but unable to go back to what had been. There were no winners here, no heroes, no villains receiving their justice. Just a system that had collapsed under its own contradictions, and millions of people realizing they'd been living inside someone else's illusion. The question now was whether they could build something better, or whether they'd just build the same cage with different bars. The man descended into the subway, disappearing into the crowd, leaving behind a world that would spend years trying to make sense of what he'd done. And the terrible certainty that they would probably learn nothing from it. In Vought Tower, Stan Edgar stood at his window looking down at the city and began drafting his resignation letter. Not because he'd failed, because he understood with perfect clarity that what came next would require a different kind of leadership. Someone who could sell hope instead of control. Someone who could make people forget they'd seen the machinery. Someone who wasn't him. In his cell, Homelander sat with his head in his hands and couldn't remember the last time he'd felt real. Couldn't remember if there had ever been a moment when he wasn't performing, wasn't calculating the angle, wasn't aware of the cameras. The man had been right. He was a product, had always been a product, and products didn't get to have breakdowns. They got recalled and replaced. In the diner in Newark, Butcher paid for breakfast no one had eaten and led his team back to the van. They had work to do. Always had work to do. The fight didn't end just because someone had proven the gods were hollow. If anything, it made the fight more necessary, because hollow gods still had hands that could kill. And people scared and confused and looking for someone to blame would give those hands permission to do terrible things. The sun rose higher over a changed city. News helicopters circled empty air where a meteor had hung. Politicians gave speeches about strength and resilience and American exceptionalism. Vaught's stock continued to fall. And somewhere in the crowd, walking toward a subway platform, a man who had held 8 million lives in his hand disappeared back into anonymity. Not because he was done, because what he'd started would continue without him. The world had seen the performance for what it was. Now, it had to decide whether to demand a better show or tear down the theater entirely.